The constant harassment day in and day out that Palestinians are suffering.
Hello, my name is Stanley Heller. Welcome to The Struggle. The Struggle is shown in over 30 cable stations from Vermont to New York City, on the internet at thestruggle.org, our YouTube channel, Struggle Video Media. Imagine if the U.S. government seized USA Today or the New York Times and made it a government mouthpiece. That's what happened in the country of Turkey. The newspaper Zaman was seized by the Erdogan government. Zaman is the biggest newspaper in Turkey. The U.S. White House issued a statement that said the move was troubling. Wow, Erdogan must be shivering in his boots after such a rebuke. The cartoons about Turkey and Erdogan here were produced by Carlos Latouf. The English website of Zaman, which is today's Zaman, has not yet been seized, but as we record, it looks like the last update was 5 days ago. In Syria, the temporary ceasefire has allowed something wonderful to return: peaceful political protest. In 100 cities and towns in Syria, thousands turned out into the streets to demonstrate, to denounce Assad, and to call for liberation. Writing on peacenews.org, Syrian Joseph Daher writes, "The Syrian revolutionary flag was seen everywhere. It is interesting to note that Salafist jihadist military forces and their symbols were absent from these popular demonstrations." Here is video from one town.
بالحقيقة ماني عرفان من وين بلش وشو أحكي وأنا شايف هاي الوجوه المليانة ثورة، المليانة حرية وكرامة، هاي الوجوه اللي ما قدر بشار الأسد ووراها إيران وروسيا ووراهم تخاذل كل دول العالم. هاي الوجوه اللي طلعت من تحت ركام المنازل، اللي طلعت من نار الدماء والأشلاء لتخبر كل العالم إنه ثورتنا مستمرة، ثورتنا مستمرة وراح تبقى مستمرة رغم تخاذل كل العالم. حتى لو حاربنا كل العالم هاي الثورة راح تبقى مستمرة بإذن الله. انتوا اللي جيتوا اليوم، انتوا اللي جيتوا اليوم، انتوا الثورة، ما حدا غيركم الثورة. انتوا اللي ضحيتوا وانتوا اللي قدمتوا، انتوا اللي بلشتوا بهاي الثورة وبتعرفوا شو راح يكون المصير. انتوا اللي واجهتوا مجازر ومذابح ما بيقدر حدا يواجهها، ومع هالشيء كملتوا واستمريتوا. انتوا الثورة، انتوا الثورة وما حدا غيركم الثورة. انتوا صبر ايوب، انتوا عصا موسى تضربوا فيها كل ظالم. انتوا صرخة يونس بطن الحوت. انتوا صبر ايوب، انتوا صبر ايوب، انتوا عصا موسى تضربوا فيها كل ظالم. انتوا صرخة يونس بطن الحوت، انتوا قميص يوسف تلقوه على سوريا من شان تكون بالاسد. انتوا الشعب، انتوا اللي سمعتوا رأي الثورة وانتوا اللي بتقرروا شو مصير هذا البلد. نحن اجتمعنا اليوم من شان نذكر كل العالم انه هاي الثورة مستمرة، انه هاي الثورة مستمرة. نحن اجتمعنا اليوم مشان نتعاهد من جديد انه نحقق كل اهداف الشهيد. نحن اجتمعنا اليوم.
For Daher's complete article, go to peacenews.org and look for his name under the columnists. Now, Reverend Ali Perry talks about photos she took of the Tent of Nations, an area of Palestine under crushing restrictions from Israeli authorities.
Strategically perched atop one of the many hills southwest of Bethlehem is Daher's Vineyard, also now known as the Tent of Nations. Since 1916, this 100-acre vineyard has been the home of the Nassers, a Palestinian Christian family whose patriarch brought it from the Ottomans. Under successive governments, British, Jordanian, and now Israeli, the successive generations of Nassers have loved and cultivated their land, raising livestock and growing crops, grapes, apricots, almonds, figs, and olives. From its start, before the word was even being used, the vineyard was eco-friendly. Its carbon footprint has been modest. The first generation of the family lived in caves, such as this one, dug deep into the terraced hillside. And that's where current family members also now live. Subsequent structures have been humble at best, a motley assortment of tents, hoop houses, stables, and single-storied buildings like this kitchen with its dining patio. The vineyard is increasingly isolated and cut off by the wall. On the surrounding hilltops are ever-expanding Israeli Jewish settlements declared illegal in 2004 under international law. The settlements are a study in contrast to the vineyard. This one, Beitar Elite, home to over 45,000 ultra-Orthodox settlers, enjoys full Israeli government subsidies, unlimited supplies of water and electricity, and population growth expected to top 100,000 by 2020. The Tent of Nations is a much coveted property. 24/7 somebody is in residence, vigilant for those occasions, and there have been many, when settlers have come, guns in hand, claiming, "God gave us this land, it is ours, not yours." The Nassers have responded to such menacing behavior with an invitation. Put down your guns and then you are welcome. But instead, some settlers have escalated their intimidation. Jumping the border fencing, they have assaulted the soul of the vineyard, uprooting its olive trees. The Israeli government also covets the vineyard. First they tried to buy the land, then declared it state property, and now they say it's a security threat. In 2003, soldiers sealed off the main road to the vineyard, bulldozing huge boulders to block access. This past May, just weeks before the harvest, Israeli soldiers uprooted over 1,500 of the vineyard's apple and apricot trees, denuding and destroying the terraces, as you can see in these before and after photos. The Nassers have started rebuilding the terraces, and with the help of some U.S. Jewish groups, plan to plant over 4,000 trees. For over 24 years, the Nassers have been in the Israeli courts, first military and now civil, defending their property rights at the cost thus far of $175,000 in legal fees. The case continues. Meanwhile, the government has cut off all electricity and water and has issued over 17 demolition orders for the vineyard's modest structures, including 2 of the caves and this goat shed. The challenges are daunting. Some might lose hope, but not the current generation of the Nasser family. They persist and prevail, deeply rooted in and strengthened by their ancestors' peacemaking legacy of beating swords into plowshares and studying war no more. Taher, who lives now in his grandfather's cave, is a living icon of hospitality. This place, he explains, is open for all people. He exudes steadfast love and loyalty. My land is like my mother. I don't sell my mother. His younger brother Daoud was only 5 when their father died, but peacemaking is in his DNA as well. His vision for the Tent of Nations: we are trying to bring bridges of understanding and trust in order for both nations to see each other as human beings and not enemies. We are the ones, he says, who can keep hope alive. Even in these dark times, there is a way out. Resilient and resourceful, the Nassers are showing that way. Lacking public water, they have built composting toilets and cisterns to collect rainwater. Needing to be self-sustaining, they also recycle gray water and their farming practices are all organic. Prohibited from building up, they are digging down, creating new caves, a chapel, for example, and this cave to welcome their many visitors from around the world. Removed from the power grid, the Nassers were the first in Palestine to install solar panels, and now have a wind turbine as well. The Tent of Nations is more than a physical landscape. It is also a spiritual one, a realm of imagination that envisions alternatives to hostility, teaching reconciliation, cooperation, and respect for the dignity of all. They host a summer peacemaking and arts camp for children, and have organized a vocational training center for the women in the neighboring Muslim village of Nahalin. Artwork is everywhere at the vineyard, decorating caves, fieldstones, even the walls of the outhouse. The mosaics offer a compelling metaphor. From brokenness, the Tent of Nations is creating something beautiful. A vision of peace and harmony that inspires the heart and gentles the soul. Gentle of soul, the Nassers are fierce in their struggle for human dignity for all. Though afflicted, they are resilient. With every fiber of their being, they embrace and embody a way of life summed up in these 5 words: we refuse to be enemies.
This is Reverend Ali Perry, whose voice you just heard on that illustrated talk. Reverend Perry is on the steering committee of the United Church of Christ Palestine-Israel Network, a former board member of the Interfaith Peace Builders and chair of the National Religious Campaign Against Torture. So, thanks for coming on the show.
Great to be here.
How many times have you been to Palestine, Israel?
I've traveled there 4 times, most recently this past November, and the first time in 2008.
What got you first interested in 2008?
Well, 2 things. A rabbi who's a good friend of mine, Brian Walt, was leading a delegation for Rabbis for Human Rights North America, and he invited me to go. And it was during a time in my life where we'd had a house fire, and I was finding any way in the world to go elsewhere, and it seemed like a good time to be traveling. And Brian and I knew each other through our work on the campaign, National Religious Campaign Against Torture. So I was intrigued by what he was doing with Rabbis for Human Rights, and I thought it was time for me to go. I had never traveled before. I wanted to. I have to say, I'd been a little nervous about going before because I was concerned that it would be hard to come back and talk about the human rights violations I expected to see, and it would be hard to come back and not have people accuse me of being anti-Semitic. And so I actually thought traveling with a delegation that was sponsored by Rabbis for Human Rights, it was large, there were 40 people, but easily over 30 were Jewish folks, and many of those were rabbis. So I thought this would be a really interesting way for me to travel. So that was my first time going.
Okay, so then the last time was in last fall 2015. And now, did you go by yourself or as part of a delegation?
Every time I've gone as part of delegations. The last 3 times have been with Interfaith Peace Builders. And their work is entirely on taking people in delegations to see the facts on the ground and meeting each time with Israeli and Palestinian peace activists.
Do they only go to Palestine, Israel, or does that group go to other countries?
It actually only goes to Palestine, Israel.
So where were some of the places that you traveled this last time?
We stayed in East Jerusalem, although we did a couple of homestays, and those are in the West Bank. We went to the village of Belin. We also went to Hebron. We went up to Jenin for the olive harvest, because this was an olive harvest delegation, and we stayed in a village outside of Jenin with a family there. We also went to Nazareth, so we were in Israel, went to Nazareth, and we went to Tel Aviv and met with various people there. We were in Bethlehem, and we went to a small, tiny village. Well, it's really not a village, it's an encampment, Susia, of people that have been dislodged by the Israeli military several times and had been threatened to be completely demolished recently. And we went.
Where is this? Where's Susia?
Susia is in the southern hills by Hebron.
So you went to many different places. So you've been there 4 times. What's new? What's different?
Well, I have to say each time in some ways is harder. It's also in some ways more inspiring in terms of the resistance of the Palestinians, but it's harder in terms of seeing the brutality of what occupation looks like and the constant harassment day in and day out that Palestinians are suffering in the West Bank. So to give you one example, when we arrived in the village of Belin, which is a village of about 2,000 people, and people will, if they've watched this, will have seen pictures of it just before our interview. And the night before, Iyad Bernat's wife, Tassahil, in the middle of the early hours in the morning, heard a sound, got up to see what it was, opened her front door, and a tear gas canister was tossed into her house. When we were in Hebron...
By Israeli soldiers.
By Israeli soldiers, right. And it's gratuitous harassment, such that you can imagine what that does for people. You can't even sleep in peace because you never know when there'll be a night raid or something like that. But night raids are when the Israeli military come in wearing night goggles to villages and round up young people, accusing them of being stone throwers and the like. It just happens constantly. So there's a sense in which people are, my sense is they're traumatized. And yet they persist because they refuse to give in to, they're not going to be terrorized.
And Belin was the town where the film 5 Broken Cameras was filmed, and subsequently another camera was filmed. I don't know, did they get their 7th camera? Do you know?
Well, actually, we brought their 12th camera. So when the film was made, there were 5 that had been broken, and there have been that many more that we brought the 12th. And they continue to resist. Every Friday there are demonstrations, and in other Palestinian villages in the West Bank, after prayers on Friday, there are demonstrations. Because in Belin, even though they succeeded in getting the path of the wall moved back by 500 meters, the settlement Modi'in Elite that's right next to it continues to occupy land. That's the village land. And every time they have their nonviolent demonstration, the military is there with tear gas canisters and stun grenades and something called skunk gas. You're probably familiar with that?
Yeah, we've talked about it several times on the show. Yeah. No, did they shoot any of that when you were there, or?
No, we did not experience skunk gas being shot. We did one day experience tear gas when we were in Bethlehem and went to a refugee camp, Ida, which is a refugee camp that was created after 1948 when Palestinians who were expelled from their villages in what's now called Israel sought refuge in various other places. And this was a group that originally there were about 800 refugees, and they are now in a camp. It's now about 5,000 on 16 acres of land, under the auspices of the UN, and you can imagine how densely populated that is. They have very little land and get water maybe 4 hours every 10 days. So, and they're right up, if you saw pictures, they're right up against the wall in Bethlehem. So they can look out to land where there are olive groves that had been there, or they'd been able to farm before their wall was put up. It's right near Rachel's tomb, which is considered a holy site, completely circled by the wall, and there are watchtowers. So there are constant incursions on this camp of Israeli military coming in. And the day we were there was a Friday. There had been prayers, and then there were skirmishes because there were nonviolent demonstrations by the Palestinians. And they
demonstrations in the camp?
Well, in the camp and actually in Bethlehem, but they went up to, this is a camp that actually at the entrance of the camp has a huge, sort of over the wall, over the road, has a huge archway with a key. And of course the key symbolizes the keys that Palestinians took from their homes in 48 when they expected, after being expelled, that they would be able to go back. And these are all people or descendants of people that had homes in what's now Israel. So the demonstration was like at the entrance, the gate of the camp. And when we arrived there, we came through a back way on our bus, and were greeted by the head of a center there, a cultural center called Laji. And we could hear the sounds of the skirmishes. We could feel the tear gas. I was breathing it in. But we actually ourselves, when we were at the cultural center and went up to the rooftop to look at rooftop gardens that they have created in conjunction with Tufts University. Tufts has been working with them to help to have these rooftop gardens because there's no land in the camp for growing food. And we went up to look at the rooftop gardens, and when we were up there, there was a gate in the wall that opened up, and the Israeli military came through it and started shooting tear gas canisters over the building that we were on top of. Was it just coincidence? Maybe. Mild for us, but for people that are exposed to that constantly, it's actually a health threat as well as a terrible harassment.
Can't imagine. So that was in Ida camp. I was there in 2007, and very compact. No place for the kids to play. I mean, there was some tiny area where the buildings didn't abut, and so that was the biggest area where people could play. It was something.
Right beneath this cultural center, there was a tiny area that was a playground, and the cultural center does amazing stuff with kids. In fact, we were entertained by a group of 7 kids. It was supposed to be 16, but because of the skirmishes, many of them couldn't get there that night. But they're learning musical instruments, and so they're performing on their instruments for us. And they're also being taught computer and other things. Fabulous what they're doing with the kids. I got back about 2 weeks after getting back to the States. We learned there'd been another incursion of the Israeli military who had gone into the cultural center, gone up to the rooftop and put an Israeli flag on the top of the cultural center.
Just to stick it to them.
Just to stick it to them, exactly. Eventually they left, but yes, just to stick. And here, people... This notion that the Palestinians are violent, I mean, what could be more fabulous and important to be doing with young people than what this cultural center is doing, to try and give them a life, to encourage them. And there's a lot of priority put on education, trying to give them a richness of life, and that's being squelched. The military, becomes a target.
I want to talk about religion a little bit. You're a Christian reverend, and I think a lot of people in the U.S., just Palestinians, they're all Muslims. But obviously that's not. The word Bethlehem should mean something to some people.
Yes, there are. I'm not sure. I think it's about 10% of the Palestinian population is Christian. And actually, by law, some of the Palestinian cities in the West Bank have to have a Christian mayor. People may be familiar, or maybe not, but the Palestinian Christian religious leaders in 2009, I think it was, came together to create a document called Kairos Palestine. And that document was inspired by the Kairos document from South Africa in 1985 and other Kairos documents. They're basically a theological reflection on the times, the current reality. It's a very powerful document that, among other things, talks about the occupation, Israel's occupation of Palestine, as a sin. Not just illegal, which it is, but as a sin. And encourages people to come and see for themselves, recognizing that the media, mainline media, does not do a helpful job in interpreting what's happening there. And among other things, encourages support for the boycott, divestment, sanctions movement, which is a nonviolent movement to say, to really put economic pressure on Israel to end its occupation and its illegalities.
And talking about religion and Christians, I just saw a film about one town called Beit Sahur, who in the first Intifada bought cows, and this irritated the Israelis no end. We'll probably talk about this another time. It was a film shown in Guilford, Connecticut by Jewish Voice for Peace, and it's called The Wanted 18, about the wanted cows and its animation. But again, Beit Zahor, if I think I'm right, it's mostly a Christian town, and a Christian town of Palestinians. Now, the question of violence and nonviolence. I mean, now, since October, there's been this flare-up in the West Bank, not Gaza, but in the West Bank, and there's been a number of Palestinians who've stabbed Israelis. There's been a lot of fake incidents where Palestinians are killed and then knives are put near them. But then there's, as you say, the efforts for decades by Palestinians of nonviolence. So why don't we talk about that a bit?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. It's really an important awareness, and again, that's something that doesn't get much coverage, the commitment of the large majority of Palestinians to nonviolence, and in many cases they've studied it, they're deeply grounded in it, whether it's in Berlin with Iyad Bernat and the demonstrations there, whether it's in Nabi Saleh. And actually, I would mention and recommend to people, if they didn't read back in March of 2013, there was a fabulous cover story in the New York Times Magazine by Ben Ehrenreich about Nabi Saleh. And the title of the story was, "If There's a Third Intifada, Will It Happen Here?" Now, most people hear the word intifada and they think suicide bombing, right? They think what happened in the second intifada. But it's an uprising, and what the point of his article is Nabi Saleh is an example of a Palestinian village where they're committed to nonviolence. They have nonviolent demonstrations, and he argues that nonviolence is a greater threat to Israel than violence. That Israel kind of knows.
You say greater threat, you don't mean a physical threat, it's just to this apartheid ethos that they have.
Well, yeah, and I think also that my sense is Israel doesn't know how to handle it.
More of the interview in a future program. Before we go, we urge you to mark March 26th, the 1-year anniversary of the horrific Saudi attack on Yemen. Thousands and thousands killed. Go to saudius.org for more information. That's our program for today. Thanks for watching. I'm Stanley Heller for The Struggle.